Hey, welcome to the review time for this week as we seek to solidify what we've read and put it back into its meta-narrative. As we review what we read this last week, we were introduced to the lives of three kings. One served for a long time, 55 years, King Manasseh. His son, Ammon, who only reigned for 2 short years. And then, of course, Josiah, which we will talk about and give more attention to during this weekly review. So under King Manasseh, though he reigned for 55 years, you see that he committed even worse atrocities against the living God, more than all the kings that preceded him and the nations around him. And as a result of that, God raised up the Assyrians, and they actually took him into captivity to Babylon. They put hooks in his nose and drug him there. Well, it was there that he came to his senses and he cried out to the living God. An amazing thing of all, that God heard his prayer there in captivity and brought him back to resume his duties as king in Judah. We're also introduced to Nahum. Nahum is a prophet during Manasseh's reign, and though he doesn't prophesy against Israel per se or Judah, he prophesies entirely against the Assyrian kingdom. And he speaks about the Assyrian kingdom, and he promises that judgment is going to come upon the Assyrians. Now, I can imagine why this prophecy would strike a chord in the hearts of Manasseh and those who are hearing him in the context in which he was given it, because they were surrounded by the Assyrians. The Assyrians, when they took northern Israel into captivity, they besieged all of the area. And in fact, they were just on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And so they were afraid of the Syrian army. And so what you see is Nahum's prophecy against Assyria is actually a comfort to the people of Judah. We're also introduced to King Ammon, who served for just two short years, and he was a wicked king like his grandfather before him. And he only lasted for 2 years because God removed him from his throne. Then we're introduced to his young son, Josiah. Josiah's story is my favorite in all the Bible, one of my favorites in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, as he becomes king when he's just a young boy. He's 8 years old. And when he was 16 years old, he begins to clean the idols out of the land. I don't know what kind of spiritual impact that someone there in his family or in his reference had in his life, but obviously had a huge impact in his life because he detested idolatry. So then when he was 20 years old, he began to clean the idols out of northern Israel. He also began to clean the idols out of Jerusalem itself, and then began to clean the idols out of the temple itself. Now, what's interesting about this whole deal, as he removes the debris and the idolatry, all these things out of the temple, the book of the law is discovered. And what I like to say about the book of the law, it's discovered in plain sight, because that's where it's supposed to be. So they discover the book of the law, and they bring it, the high priest brings it to the king, and they begin to read the book of the law to the king. And when he hears, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the words of the God, he hears about the blessings and curses, and he imagines, here we are this day, and it's a direct result of our disobedience, a prolonged disobedience against the living God of Israel. So he puts ashes on his chest, and he puts sackcloth over that, and he leads Israel in the greatest revival of their days. And what's very interesting to him, he restores Bible literacy as a core value there in Israel's midst, because he pulls the entire congregation together and he reads out loud the book of the law. And as they're reading, they understand that they've not celebrated the Sukkot for 1,000 years and so on. And so they reconnected with their past through the memorials that God had established in the book of the law to them. Sadly, Josiah's life ends poorly as he refused the wisdom of staying out of a battle that he has no business in, that he meddles in, and as a result of that, he experiences a premature death. And we also are introduced to Habakkuk, who prophesies during this period, and Zephaniah. Well, Habakkuk, he spoke of an imminent Babylonian invasion. Meanwhile, God seemed strangely silent in the midst of all that was going on, the wickedness as it increased towards the end of Judah's reign, of Josiah's reign. And he makes this statement in Habakkuk 1 verse 3. He says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry, and will you not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and yet you do not save. Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble?" Here, this is a troubled prophet. He's crying out to the living God, and he can't see God doing anything. Isn't that what happens? Like in our culture that we live, we see it seems like that more and more wicked are taking place, and we're crying out to you, God, why aren't you doing anything? But he concludes, what I love his conclusion in chapter, later on in the book, he says, "But the righteous will live by faith." even though we don't see justice, even though we don't sometimes see the activity of God as he redeems those who cry out to them, he judges those who refuse his overtures. But we know this, that we can live by faith in the living God who will do absolutely what's right and everything that he has promised. Then in conclusion, we see Zephaniah. Zephaniah is of royal lineage. His great-great-grandfather was King Hezekiah. Zephaniah mentions the day of the Lord more than any other prophet in the Old Testament. Judah would be judged, certainly, but he ends his message with a promise that God would restore his people to their land. So history does not spiral out of God's control. Although he allows men to do what they will do, he overrules it all. And that's the comfort we have as we look at and answer the question that Habakkuk himself answers. Lord, how long shall I cry out? Well, we can be certain of that God works in history and God will accomplish the purpose in which he's intended and judging the nations and bringing redemption.